This video is for commentary and analysis under fair use. The views expressed are my own, based on publicly available information and my interpretation of it.
I went back through several interviews Steve Shirilla has given about his daughter Mackenzie and the crash that killed Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. And after a while, I stopped hearing individual interviews. I started hearing patterns. The questions change. The interviewer changes. Sometimes even the explanation changes. But Steve keeps returning to the same arguments. So today, rather than asking whether Steve Shirilla is right or wrong, I want to ask a different question. What does Steve Shirilla want us to believe? Hi, everybody. I'm Stina, and this is Motive and Method. For those of you who are new here, I have a Bachelor of Arts in Communication and more than 25 years of professional experience working with written and verbal communication. What I do here is a little bit different from traditional true crime coverage. I'm interested in language, how people frame events, the words they choose, the words they avoid, contradictions, and especially the patterns that begin to emerge when we listen closely. And today, we're going to do exactly that. If you're new to the Mackenzie Shirilla case, here's the short version. In the early morning hours of July 31st, 2022, then 17-year-old Mackenzie Shirilla was driving in Strongsville, Ohio, with her boyfriend, 20-year-old Dominic Russo, and their friend, 19-year-old Davion Flanagan. The vehicle crashed into a building going around 95 miles per hour. Dominic and Davion were killed. Mackenzie survived with serious injuries. In August 2023, following a bench trial, Mackenzie was convicted of multiple charges, including murder. She received 2 concurrent sentences of 15 years to life. Mackenzie's father, Steve Shirilla, has remained adamant that his daughter did not intentionally cause that crash. I've analyzed Steve before, quite a bit actually. But for this video, I wanted to do something a little bit different. Instead of taking one interview and responding to what Steve says, I went across several interviews and asked, does the argument change? Or does Steve keep returning to the same ways of explaining what happened? And I found 4 patterns. So let's start with the first one. Pattern 1. Nobody knows. Listen to Steve speaking with TMZ. Listen particularly to what he says about whether anyone can know what happened inside that car.
I can't explain the speed. First of all, I have no idea. Nobody's ever going to know what happened in that car. It's not that the car was going fast. It's not that the car crashed. It's why. There's no explanation of why. And the prosecution, even in this documentary, says, look, I turned over every rock. I looked at everything and I couldn't find anything. So it's murder.
Okay, this is important because there is something perfectly reasonable at the center of what Steve is saying. None of us was inside that car. We don't have a recording of the conversation or lack of conversation among the 3 people inside it during those final moments. Dom and Davion tragically cannot tell us what happened, and Mackenzie has said that she doesn't remember. So yes, there are things about those final moments that we may never know. But what Steve did in this argument, he moves from, we don't know everything that happened, to something closer to, therefore you cannot know why it happened. And these aren't necessarily the same thing. This is where we have to talk very briefly about circumstantial evidence. A criminal case does not necessarily require an eyewitness who saw a defendant form an intention. In fact, think about how difficult that standard would be. Intent happens inside a person's mind. Very rarely does someone announce exactly what they intend to do, in front of a reliable witness immediately before doing it. That is why fact finders are permitted to infer intent from the totality of the circumstances. And under Ohio law, circumstantial evidence can support a conviction by itself. Ohio courts have repeatedly said direct and circumstantial evidence have the same inherent probative value. That does not mean every inference made by a prosecutor is correct, of course, and it does not mean you have to agree with the verdict in this case. And also, of course, it doesn't mean that alternative explanations shouldn't be considered. It means something much more narrow. Nobody knows everything that happened inside that car does not automatically mean, therefore, intent cannot be established. A fact finder can consider the circumstances and draw reasonable inferences from them. And here's where Steve's language really started getting my attention. Because if Steve's argument were simply, nobody knows, we could stop right there. But Steve doesn't stop there. Because when the question changes, his certainty changes with it. Which leads me to pattern 2. But I know. This next clip comes from Steve's interview with Chris Cuomo. And listen carefully to the sequence.
Their case is it was intentional.
But it wasn't.
Now, when you say that with such conviction, is that because your daughter has ever explained to you or your wife that something happened in the car?
No, she does not remember. That has been her story from day one. There's no memory of it. And I'm telling you, I know my daughter does not like pain. She would never, ever hurt herself intentionally. It's just not, I know my daughter. I've known that kid all her life. I know when my daughter lies. I just know my daughter.
And there it is. And this is probably the pattern that interests me most. On one side, we don't know. Mackenzie doesn't remember. Nobody knows exactly what happened inside that car. But on the other side, I know. I know my daughter. I know when she lies. I know she wouldn't do this intentionally. And I want to be careful here because Steve is her father. I don't find it strange that a father believes he knows his daughter. And most parents will tell you that they recognize things about their children that strangers wouldn't. So I totally get that. And they may believe they know when their child is being truthful. And Steve clearly believes that. I'm not questioning whether he believes it. I'm looking at how that belief functions inside his argument. Because Steve is asking everybody else to reject conclusions that he believes are based on insufficient knowledge. And yet, his own conclusion ultimately rests, at least in part, on a different kind of certainty. I know my daughter. That is not the same evidentiary standard. Steve's personal knowledge of Mackenzie may be profoundly persuasive to Steve. But that doesn't necessarily answer the legal question of what can reasonably be inferred from the evidence. And notice the asymmetry. When we're talking about the prosecution's conclusion, you can't know. When we're talking about Steve's conclusion, I know. According to Steve, I know, Steve knows. And once I noticed that, another pattern became much easier to hear. Because what happens in the space between these two positions? If nobody knows exactly what happened, then what could have happened? Which leads me to pattern 3. What if? We're back with Steve and Chris Cuomo. Listen to this short portion.
There's a picture with her slipper on the gas pedal stuck underneath the brake. Could have been. The car has a history. Toyota's cars like that have a history of that gas pedal accelerating. Okay? Mind you, I'm not saying that's what happened. I don't know. What I'm saying is a possibility. And if it's a possibility, how do you rule it out that it wasn't?
I deliberately didn't play that entire section because it goes on for quite a while. Steve raises a number of possible alternative explanations during his interviews, not just with Cuomo, but with every single one of the interviews that I've seen from Steve so far. He talks about the possibility of a medical episode. He raises Mackenzie's reported history of passing out and POTS. He talks about the possibility that something happened involving one of the boys. He mentions drug use, including shrooms. He raises the possibility of something going wrong mechanically with the car. And Steve sometimes acknowledges exactly what these are: possibilities. He's not necessarily telling us this is definitively what happened. He is saying, could this have happened? What if it was this? What if it was that? Can you rule this out? Can you rule that out? And here's what fascinates me about that communication pattern. The individual explanation changes, but the function of the explanation doesn't. Every additional possibility opens another door away from intentional conduct. And rhetorically, Steve doesn't necessarily have to prove that Mackenzie passed out. He doesn't necessarily have to prove a mechanical malfunction, and he doesn't have to establish exactly what happened between the people inside that car. For his argument to work, he only needs you to think, well, maybe. Maybe there is another explanation. Maybe we can't rule this out. Maybe we can't be certain. And again, this is not inherently an illegitimate question. Alternative explanations do matter, and reasonable doubt also matters. But here's the question I kept coming back to. If Steve believes other people are filling gaps in the evidence with assumptions, could Steve sometimes be filling those same gaps with possibilities that favor his own conclusion? One side, the prosecution side, according to Steve, fills the unknown with an inference. The other side, Steve's side, fills the unknown with alternatives. And Steve believes the first one created something else entirely: a story. Which brings us to pattern number 4. They created the story. Now, this clip comes from Steve's interview with True Crime This Week. The discussion turns to the prosecution's position that Mackenzie and Dom were breaking up. Listen to Steve's language.
Again, they were not breaking up. For anyone to say they were breaking up, it is a lie. There's no base. It's a baseless narrative from the prosecution.
There are 2 words in there that matter to me: baseless narrative. Steve doesn't merely disagree with the prosecution's interpretation. He frames it as a story they constructed. And this idea appears elsewhere in his interviews. Information was ignored. It wasn't presented. People made assumptions. The documentary left things out. The prosecution created a narrative. The judge made leaps. Other people don't have all the facts. Even earlier in this same True Crime This Week interview, Steve describes the prosecution as giving the families a place to focus their anger and calls it the prosecution's story and narrative. And that finally brought the 4 patterns together for me. Because Steve isn't really offering one consistent alternative account of what happened inside that car. At least that's not what I hear across these interviews. He is doing something broader. He is challenging the ability of anyone else to construct a definitive account at all, except for Steve himself, of course. Steve has a definitive conclusion of his own, always. So, what does Steve want us to believe? Well, after listening across these interviews, I don't think Steve necessarily wants us to believe one specific alternative explanation. And I don't think the message is, for instance, that Mackenzie definitely passed out, or the car absolutely malfunctioned, or something definitely happened involving one of the boys. Because Steve himself doesn't always claim to know which, if any, of those things occurred. Instead, I hear a larger argument. It goes something like this: nobody can know exactly what happened inside that car, but I know my daughter didn't intentionally do this. There are other things that could have happened. And the prosecution took what it couldn't know and turned it into a story. Nobody knows, but I know. What if they created the story? 4 different patterns, but together they form one remarkably consistent argument. And there's one question I think we're left with. If uncertainty is enough to challenge the prosecution's conclusion, how much certainty should we assign to Steve's? Because 2 things can be true at the same time. Steve can genuinely, deeply believe his daughter. And Steve's belief does not necessarily establish what happened. The prosecution can construct a narrative from circumstantial evidence, and calling something a narrative does not, by itself, make the underlying inference false. Likewise, identifying alternative possibilities does not establish that any of those alternatives occurred. That's why I wanted to analyze Steve this way. Not is Steve lying, not is Steve manipulating people. I don't know that, and I'm not going to pretend that I do. The question I'm interested in is, how does Steve make his argument? And once you listen across these interviews, instead of listening to each one in isolation, I think the structure becomes much easier to hear. Steve repeatedly asks us to leave room for uncertainty, while leaving very little room for uncertainty about the conclusion he has reached. And that is a pattern I wanted you to hear today. Now, I want to hear what you guys think, not simply whether you agree with Steve or disagree with him. Listen to these 4 patterns. Nobody knows, but I know. What if they created the story? Do you hear the same structure I do? Or do you interpret Steve's argument differently? Please let me know in the comments, because I have a feeling we're going to have a really interesting conversation about this one. If you're new here and this kind of analysis interests you, subscribe to Motive and Method. I'm Stina, and around here, words matter. So listen closely. See you next time.